Alright, now just Dewa Deba, Dunga Midoba Chivares, the Enzada, and Dewa de Tupu Warre, and then Dunga the Se Warre. Then Dewa de la Yang, Nekapti Dewa, and Dingy Dewa, Kidina Dewa, and Dewa, and Yang to get it, New Wachizan, Nekap Dewa, Dingy Dewa, Tarbata, and this Tabukopana, Sanjoko Toyati, and the Dingy Dewa, yes. Says not that day, and to get Dunga say at Digi to get the Lea, that Chi Twinglet in it. Digi to get that Dunga say at Nang Semke, some of the Danchin, Dunga said Digi to Nina there, that answer so Nang similar dinner, and Digi to Tan Dunga said Hadigor, and a chick sugar water.
Good evening. So we've been looking at, for the last number of weeks, at this text, Key to the Middle Way. And what we've covered thus far is the presentation of that first, recognizing that all of us on a deep level within are the same in wanting to experience only happiness and to be freed from all problems and difficulties. And the type of happiness we long for is a happiness that is lasting and stable, a happiness we've yet to experience because it's the happiness of liberation and enlightenment. This is happiness that is not punctuated and never will be by even a moment of displeasure. To achieve such lasting, stable happiness, we have to accumulate the causes that will lead to happiness and eliminate the causes that will otherwise lead to suffering. And in terms of accumulating causes and for happiness and eliminating causes for suffering, both happiness of a temporary nature as well as that of a lasting, stable nature, we have two sources, one being the outer material world and the other being the inner mental world.
Digi to Yata, Dunga said the la, some Tana Shinku, Shivala, that Jiggy and Jango or tear some Bomsum Jego essay. Then Jig Duendia and Jig Turbig Duendeliana and some Taje, and do to some Gomsum Jegores. That tear some Gomsum Jeva Delaya and Jiggy Ma Manjugi, Jetan Delay, that Dembashi said Jikungo Dembashi, kissing the Shesara Carson. Dependency said, I got some church shake and Gansa, Jungore, Chizan Gansa, Matembe, so and Charlatan said the shake and church soon had that, but the church you gabla, and then Chizan Yamin Chitan Shudan and Yamin Chidakala, Dependency said, and then Jur what that is not kissing that Jishu Sour at the Dependency called.
And of these two methods, the outer material world and the inner world, the Buddha Dharma focuses on the development and transformation of our inner world, our way of thinking. In order to transform our way of thinking, which is done through eliminating causes that will lead to suffering and accumulating causes that will lead to happiness, we need to gain knowledge. And independent on our knowledge, we have to integrate this knowledge within ourselves, because it's through that process that we change our way of thinking, turning our way of thinking away from accumulating causes that will otherwise lead to suffering, and focusing our mind in areas that lead to the accumulation of causes that lead to happiness. So in order to be able to train our mind effectively, we need to hear, reflect, and meditate. And we need to do so repeatedly over sustained periods, repeatedly hearing teachings, reading texts in order to deepen our understanding. And even when it's a topic we know quite well, continue to hear and read on that topic so as to gain inspiration, deepen our knowledge, and strengthen our determination to transform our mind through the complementary process of reflection and meditation. In this context then, last time we came to look at the 4 reliances on the top of page 4. And these 4 reliances present how one is to engage in the process of hearing teachings as well as training our mind through reflection and meditation.
Then当然去年比较啦，他点把西是对开始呢，做去年看刚上了每天把的，俺去了点是的，一些做去了一的，把什么都去了做，结果来是的，当然这里刚上了每天去了点了对，其他俺就去点看的了呀，对吧？当一切当俺这个结果了，因为这个刚上可能来结束去，甚至可送下去去的了，每年把呢，俺这个每年把人嘛修把呢。那也给住嘛的时候，就是刚上了点节，刚上可能两点吧节，那这个学习学会的开始点的节，可能这里去的买学会呢，你看这里其他拉玛里点吧节，但就是要不来的呢，第三的去的每年吧呢，那看就那时候新的买的是，那亚度东啊西啊，但地区出的新的买的，其实今年做啊这个那么真的去年还得给钱的是，其实地你这边结婚的是去刚上来没得去了点些的。其实刚上竞争的这些呢，去每年把那的用了个，其实去其他大参考嘛，其实电上去了定过的也是的，那个时候的去修过的时候了的，去修过刚上来每天去了电是的，刚上的去，当然都那么热身的了，也见早全部的这样过来也是的，现在地址了去每年把呢，那新买的去了，东啊就过短大新买的话，其实去每年把呢，其实你刚上来电把的，去了没电把的。其实但今天这个那么确定的了，第八的一切结果我的是不是结果的呢？做那么个去送一个年的结清不来时候去了电视的，去了电过来是电视的。
The first reliance is rely on the teaching, not on the personality or the person. The advice then that is being given here is that whilst one does need to rely on a teacher and should have a respectful attitude towards one's teacher, the relationship that one has is that of teacher and student. So this implies, as the student, that one has a relationship of hearing teachings, receiving guidance, not just merely saying, I'm connected to this famous teacher, but actually to receive their teachings. And in one's interactions, one's focus should be on the teaching that is being given and not on the person or on their personality. So again, whilst one should of course have a respectful attitude towards the teacher, one's focus should be on their teaching, not on their reputation or their title, but rather on what they are saying. Because it's in dependence on hearing their teaching that we will be able to transform our way of thinking.
他刚上来每天去了店来用的，我在那边真的去年的时候，那么来科学结果的，那么来这个结果嘛的，毕竟拿来刚上来每天去了店来的话，那个多少才个那个用过什么用过啊？今年呢，就拿出结果的，其实刚上来每天去了店来的。但这里啊，这可是对那这些人，不能干啥，他们家全部是我这因为呢，这里啊，年纪去过去了，这个大的些没问呢，这里主要的，去啊，我些呢，只要我些米，这个年轻人的，那明没有钱呢，这里啊，年都没有钱呢，干啥了，对吧？结果的，这，但然后干啥了，每天去了，但是这那么子了，这个。学习学过，所个那么这里啊，学习学，但按这结果过的呢，那么这里去年过的，那么这去每年吧，就那么的学习学，那么了，按这个年过学，所学习学，对吧？是对吧？呢，那么这里去嘛，学吧呢，那所去新嘛，这是第刚上来定过的，那去了定过嘛，这是去了定过的，是的，做那么个那么当，那么从一个去年拿的做的年的，节切定啊这个。去学的来说，就是去学的辛苦活了，或者是老长结果了，就是去学的给全部来说了。
Reading this first reliance, it would be an error to take it too far or too literally, thinking that, yes, I understand I need to receive teachings from a teacher and that my focus should be on the teachings, and therefore I don't need to have a respectful attitude towards the teacher or pay no regard to the teacher themselves. This would be an error. One certainly should have a respectful attitude towards the teacher so as to build up a suitable basis to be able to be fully influenced by their teachings. But what one is being warned against here is being overly attracted or even distracted by someone's reputation, their title, their style of delivery, these kinds of superficial qualities. Rather, one's focus should be on the quality of the teaching that they're delivering, not how the teaching is being delivered or the reputation of the person giving the teaching. Because without being aware of this, one may well be more attracted to someone with a great name and reputation, as opposed to someone who's quite humble and keeps themselves in the background. But you as an individual may receive far more benefit from the more humble teacher than the one with a greater reputation. So here, with a respectful attitude towards the teacher, one keeps one's focus on the teaching. That is the meaning of the first reliance.
Sikti Turkure in a Kashian Siglet Dumbala, the Signambu in the bed, Ninjibura, Jiki Cabaro, Jishevan and Yen, Dunda Shera Mevene, and Dinikian by the Data Maresor. She's not that Dunda Ningbudi, Delia, Silla Median Della Density, Sikti Yamba Zamjan, Chu Yamba Zamje, Yanje, Danga Chu Shubins and Yanje, Dunda Samata Shashavena. Yagi to have done out of Mares, Silam, did Silla Demba Zama, the Dundala some tango Mares. Then the church, Yueda, Nieda, Niembina, the Zoda, Dundadi somebody, Kitchenbore. She's a Dunda, some Yana and sometimes Dunda the Haku water. To the Hamogona, Churbania, Manjuge, and the Jigget, go to Goma, Dunga Seata, the Utua Tablam, the Shing to Goma. Chesenza, Chu Yango, the Zo. Donda de la Nienje, Donda de Karima, Delia Shimjuche Javache, Donda de Toyalia, Bessu Cheche or Yes, Cholam, Chek, Sidney Nane, Silamid, Della Density, Chisati Yango, Marsilla Dugo, Sig Yango Mares, Dunda sometimes the degree said, the Neonsi or the Maris, Chisan Dunda Yango or in a, it's got Sidney Yango or in a, so Yam said, a dying I choose you and Shashana, Donda she took much, is not Donda to Kichimbuji, Donda the best. Some down the kitchen, which you create, Silamid, Della Dance, Donda Jitty. And Silamid, Della Dance, and Kazan Shutava Jigger, Signambu, the Bay, Ninja, or the Share Kavara, she will share Dondal Bishara made in air, and Jik Denisha, and Adi Ninja would be Benning Bush or Diesel in air. Penny Share Kavada, Bed Signing to a share machine, Bed Jik Dondadi, I would not Jikta Shevena, just not Donda Yoba because I Nyango, Donda, some dormant. Siktil Niabu Yena Mena, the Gayana Mena to Gayomas Niela, and don't so do not education for his.
The second reliance then, rely on the meaning, not on the words. So here, this builds on the first reliance, where we're encouraged to focus our attention on the teaching being given. And here, now in the second reliance, we're being encouraged to focus on the meaning, not to just be content with merely hearing a teaching. We need to reflect on the meaning of what is being taught. If one is just hearing a teaching, receiving it in a literal way, not personalizing it, not taking that teaching and reflecting on how it matches with one's own lived experience, it will be difficult for the teaching to touch one's heart. And it will be particularly difficult for the teaching to transform one's heart, transform one's way of thinking. The key point that's being emphasized in the second reliance, the meaning of relying on the meaning, is that one needs to reflect repeatedly over a sustained period on the meaning of the teachings. This is essential. We should be applying our effort to receiving many teachings and reflecting on their meaning. This is where we need to put our energy in, not merely putting energy into receiving a lot of teachings, but reflecting on their meaning as well. It's not enough just to collect teachings. I've received this, I've received that. One must reflect on the meaning in order for the Dharma to be able to transform one's mind. The second meaning, as I mentioned previously, the second meaning of the second reliance is that we shouldn't be distracted by the eloquence of the presentation or perhaps by the humor that is imbued in the teaching. Whilst we can enjoy the presentation, of course, one's focus here needs to be on the meaning of what's being presented. In other words, whilst one hears a teaching, reflect on the meaning, personalize it to yourself, see how it applies to yourself, and thereafter, receiving teachings, continue to think about the meaning of the teaching one is receiving.
Dadi nibudi nganjugi hawaegi lela oro changzo nyamnyoro shi mangboye ruwadang jida jige namigi dang nganzu ruwar chine jige chushuyal jikje lamaro shuyon delia shibshu shuya delia jini jik chushuyal shirago mara sosu jikje jiyongruwa dizongan zuyo wache. 다야 지 최슈베네 최슈베스데 슈이제 안 돈다들 산마다제 안 지 녀마지 지 슈인지 슈인 세징아 지 돈다 산마다데 당아서 나도 지라 망보 당아 수 녀만디네 여름제를 송주 망보 슈레 안에 지게 직된 라마 망보전 송주 슈야레 안 지게 질 베드 슈야 슈고르디나 가브르 돈다 산마다 샤샤데 망보용으로 제가 돈다 산마다 지자디 돈다 산 대소소수게 저기 냠뇨 토네 먼저 하고 두고도와 시사 된다 선마다나 된다다 하고 고금매바데.
So these are really, these two reliances are of such importance, and I think we probably all have experience. I know in my life I've received so many teachings from His Holiness and my lamas in the monastery, and I wasn't always as attentive as I could have been. And I didn't always utilize my time as well as I could have to reflect on the meaning. And that then, of course, has an impact in terms of how the teachings have touched me. So here, we need to look at ourselves and see how well we have related to the teachings we've received, or interacted with the teachings that we receive. It's not merely enough to collect teachings, saying I've received on these many topics, but look at what impact they've had on your mind. This is a better guide.
That's somebody then til døen deler ya jangdøen den ngedøen ni yores dinana zo jangdøen del samdang gores jangdøen di go samdang gores gora 제가 다 장도는 람노 가서 장도는 ngedøen ni na zo ngedøen del samdang gores gora 지난 장도는 람노 군주비 취되게 해서 그래 장도는 군주비 취돼 ngedøen스네 최탐지 뭐 라신 뭐 동반이 되서 그래 ngedøen스 그래 제가 되는 자다 ngedøen 장도니 나는 조 ngedøen 고 신고고 마신 바에는 녀모 바투 말해서 그래 배당아 저게 장도는 내가 저기 베넬 람 베능아 저게 지게 어다지 잠로 제고야로 다 잠로셔야 다 잠콘조 숨 잠로래서 잠로 제고야 다 되는 잠 이제 삼다야 다 미다바 삼다 대수의 삼다 신보이네 대송은 저기 냠내진 야고래 이내 대수 동반이 뭐 최담이 라신 뭐 맞고 동반이데 맞도바 있나 녀모 보기 보디 싸원의 방투고 마 매버서 투고 말해 제가 대수 냠내 제도 배 야고래 대 이내 디 콤바 점병한 저기 녀모 자원의 방투고 말해 마토바는 아주 띵이 대화디 톱투고 탈바 탐지킴 거와 톱투고 말해 동아 윤이 매바디 매버서 투고 말해 지난 디니에서 뇌된다 장된의 뇌된이나 쪼다 돼서 점로다 뇌중 자세 람 냠르림 뇌와 하고 거래 또 냠내고 하고 거다 디기 디바제 동반이라 산마다와 샤바이나 는 아주 녀모 방투고 말해 제네 인자 디나데 디나 신선 쪼다 동반이들이야 뭐라신 간신에 된 뇌된들 봐 동반이를 봐 제바제 삼나 디도투와 저고래서 그러다 또난 된들에 장된나 하고 얘기 니즈들 장된 군주배 최다 ngo tongpa yi nane ta ngo tongpa ni le nge pardo di toba je ha ko je ko res ne ma da di ha mo na nyong bu pa to ma res ko.
The third reliance, rely on the definitive meaning, not the interpretive. So now this again builds on, because we had in the first reliance, rely on the teaching. The second reliance, rely on the meaning of the teaching. Now the third reliance is the meaning of the teaching we can understand in two ways. There are those teachings which are definitive and those which are interpretive. And of the two, the definitive is most important. So what is included then in interpretive teachings? It's those teachings about everything other than emptiness. So topics such as impermanence, refuge, love and compassion and so forth. And these would be included amongst conventional phenomena. Whereas the teachings of definitive meaning are those on emptiness. And the reason that these are said to be the ones that one must focus on is because on one hand, so we can say two clear reasons. On one hand, some people may be more attracted to the method style of teachings, the interpretive teachings, such as refuge and impermanence, love and compassion, and just focus on these. And whilst these are crucial teachings, they will not lead to the elimination of the afflictions. They will not on their own lead to one attaining freedom from suffering. Therefore, and now we come to the second meaning, one has to rely on the definitive meaning, the texts of definitive meaning, because they are on emptiness, and emptiness, or the wisdom side of the teachings. These are indispensable for the elimination of the afflictions and freedom from suffering. So again, method and wisdom teachings are important, but the emphasis, or what is of crucial importance, is the teachings of definitive meaning, those on emptiness, because it's independence on those that one will attain freedom from suffering.
장든디게 삼당고 말당 예던 기부치고서 동이 동반이 자냐 겁네 삼단의 디그레 사야지 용식이로 와 지자디 근데 진바도 추rim도随便 냠는데 추림 냠는데 디서면 동반이 또 투에 가고 차고 지자디니자 군주비 쉬기 냠는디요 인지미지 고고거래 대능한도 장들라미데 예던라 텐라도 장든기 냠는 디삼징에 냠는 지규 삼제 다 동반이 거다 다음에 거 삼는 마당 바지 균일로 좀 마셔베네 디야게 주고 말지자 인지 민징 예버도 유 라신마 동반마 또 고고래 사시 숨고 받아.
With this third reliance, it's important that one doesn't fall into either extreme view, thinking that only that wisdom teachings need to be practiced because that is said to be of greater importance. That would be an error, as would be an error of just focusing on the method teachings. Because why one has to focus on teachings on emptiness, so here those of definitive meaning, is because it's through realizing emptiness, the cultivating wisdom, that one will eliminate suffering and the afflictions completely. But if one were to only focus then on teachings of definitive meaning and either completely or largely ignore the method teachings, those of interpretive meaning, one is not likely to realize emptiness. One needs the merit that is accumulated through, for example, training in generosity, ethical restraint, patience, and so forth. One needs both sides of method and wisdom in order to attain radical transformation of our way of thinking.
당 예전에서는 예전 동반이 있어요. 당 예전에야 될라야 안내시게 남실라 밑에 이실라 띵에서 순고로와 지바들 남실라 밑에 이실라 띵에서 시바르와 제가 네 가르순고라서네 당 예전 될라야 아니 예전 세대 동반이지 동반이 또 별로 될라 아니 제바 체마 아니 지 또바 체마담 예 동반이 또 별로 될라 또바 체마담 웃음 체마 ni yungurwa toba chema no ngosun chema ni dene zanda namshela midin se de namshi de toba chema de tongba yi toba yi tongba yi to so na ta tongba yi to so samje di ma gom ba je den ya ge ma ta ba no ngosum yungo gyulma to ba je ta tang tongba yi to so sha sha ba ni di zemi ti ma re ti di zemi yomo ba tu ma re je san tongba yi toba di tongba yi toba di ni na yo res je san di 균 추셔레스 추르레스 추셔레데 그런 도고르데 나 그런 추셔레스 지산 로 약셔데 말레스 지산 데네 인잔 디콤 곰발레 데네 가르쳐서 예실레 띠스 동용 온숨도 베이시데 랑귤레 개버체 오레스 지산 디 동용 온숨도 이시 개버체 오레스데 남실레 미데 예실레 띠스 디스고데
Then the fourth reliance, rely on exalted wisdom, not on a mere conceptual consciousness. So we heard now in the third, because each of these reliances build one on top of the other, each going to deeper levels. So we've heard in the third, we need to rely on the teachings of definitive meaning, in other words, the wisdom teachings, those on emptiness. Now we come to the fourth. When one comes to realize the subject or the topic of emptiness, one does so through a realizing consciousness. So the object would be that is realized is emptiness, realized through a subject or a consciousness. One first realizes through a conceptual consciousness. Here, one is being warned not to be satisfied with this realization. Let's be very clear. Realizing emptiness is incredibly important. But what one is being guarded against is being satisfied with merely a conceptual realization. As great as that is, don't rest on your laurels. You need to go further. Because there are two types of consciousnesses that will realize emptiness. Firstly, it will be a conceptual consciousness. Thereafter, a direct perception. And the direct perception is unmistaken. The conceptual consciousness, this is a dualistic consciousness. It is still mistaken. And having an error within it, the conceptual consciousness, it means it's not the best quality of realization. It needs to be cultivated further. And one needs to cultivate the initial realization for conceptual consciousness until it becomes a direct perception. A direct realization of emptiness. And a direct realization of emptiness is an exalted wisdom.
Samola mibi midobe sem teya samola mibi toba chema gomde gomjeduna sana temba na midobe shisu gyuru se de kissing on the lottery ba. Jidu samola mibi midobe gi sem se de galorsan. Samola mibe midobalane demba majubala gore jisan midobe semne de demba majuba to be lo la gore da lo se de jisan dela ne demba majuba to be lo dela midobe semdela demba majuba to be ke jeba chema yongore jishe yongore moson chema yongore sunga yongore wa demba tongyu to be lo labna tongyu to be lo na lo ya jishe yore tong jeba yore moson chema to ba chema moson chema ni sunga yode ke chago wa.
So everyone should have a loose leaf A5 page before you, where there are a few new translations on this page, but primarily point 4 has been transformed. So we looked at this last time, but we're going to recover it now because the translation is quite different. So the first sentence remains unchanged with respect to the definitive meaning. One should not rely on a dualistic consciousness, but on an exalted wisdom realizing non-true existence. So it's a little different from last time, but it's similar. Now again, let's comment on it on the next line. Cultivate a mind realizing the profound object of non-true existence. So cultivating a mind. So this is now a generic term, just mind. There are many different types of mind. So here in this sentence, cultivate a mind. It refers to 3 different types of mind. An inferential valid cognizer, a subsequent cognizer, or a direct valid cognizer. Any of those three could be what is referred to here within this one term, mind.
Dene gomba gus gomba ina ane di gomje tuna sanna tenpa na mido be sheso gyuru sidi toba tsema ya gomje ne tomba ni ngosum no to yong du dele ya tomba ni ngosum no to be ge ane ishi se le yes si ngosum charu ko yes dus tango tomba ni ngosum to be lo chaya de tangbo tomba ni to be toba tsema ya gomje ane ngosum ni ngo gyu ko yes ondu sun go da.
The paragraph then continues. Well, let's read this again. Okay. Cultivate a mind, realizing the profound object of true existence, namely a conceptual valid cognizer apprehending the profound. As mentioned last time, the profound refers to emptiness. So the object that is realized, the topic that is realized, is the profound or emptiness. And the consciousness here now is narrowed. It says a conceptual valid cognizer. And this is because the initial realization will be a conceptual valid cognizer, either an inferential valid cognizer or its subsequent cognizers. But we should not be satisfied with that. We need to take our realization further. Because this now is what I mentioned a few segments before when talking about the fourth reliance, or introducing the fourth reliance, that we should not be content with a mere conceptual consciousness, but rely on an exalted wisdom. And that is what's being presented here. One first realizes with a conceptual valid cognizer, which is a conceptual consciousness. But this needs to be developed further. And now the last sentence, this becomes an exalted wisdom, realizing non-true existence when a clear appearance of the object of meditation arises. So what this is saying, so that is firstly, cultivate a mind, that part. There are three different kinds of minds that this refers to. Inference, or conceptual consciousnness, its subsequent cognizer, or a direct valid cognizer, which is a direct perceiver. But this needs to, one first then realizes, then in the second part, namely a conceptual valid cognizer, the first time one realizes, it's an inferential valid cognizer, or its subsequent cognition. But this needs to be developed further, and this is the key point being made here. This needs to be developed further into a direct perceiver, or an exalted wisdom, and that's the last line. This becomes an exalted wisdom, realizing non-true existence when a clear appearance of the object of meditation arises. So in brief, because what's written in this paragraph, maybe for us as English speakers, isn't incredibly clear. But the meaning is, as was explained in the outset of the four reliance, it means don't be satisfied with a conceptual realization of emptiness. This still has a fault in it. It's a dualistic appearance. It needs to be taken so that that fault gets eradicated and one develops an exalted wisdom or a direct realization. So it needs to be developed further. That is the meaning of what has been presented there in that paragraph. So now moving on to the next section, the necessity of reasoning. And here also just to say, the outlines have all been inserted. They aren't in the text. So they're not separate sections. They really do flow one into the other. But the outlines were inserted just to hopefully aid navigation in the text. Okay, so now returning to the text. Well, for you it's still on, you keep using the page you're handed out because one word was removed. Moreover, the initial generation of that conceptual consciousness must depend on correct reasoning.
That did topa city, did topa city, don't design shares or they said data, design tomba topic loss. Just then they topa city, tomba topic law, topa di Tsuke, Dambo Harki was also not topa in tomba topaki, topati, Jabaki or just then Dambo Harki, tomba topi, Jabati, Dijela and Geshe, then also you rimbal maso sumyorwa. Jezanda, did topa the Dambo tomba in topi, Jaba, topa di Kiewala, Sardu Kiewa, the Dambo Kiewas, or Sardu Kiewa young, and Kiewa young, Sardu Kiewa tiller, and aging Yanji. Tuesday, Jigribes and Lamsaki, who married Carson Delia, Dikiwala, Tombani, Toyala, Tombani, Tambo, Toyala, Gimse Mambo, some Tangus, and Gimse Yandala Tingles, Gimse Yandabala Tingi, and some Taji, Tombani topic, Lodi or Mado, Gimse Yandala Mademba, and Toki Mares, Tenza, Tartuna, Tombani Toyagi, Dondapa, Tartuk Della, and so. And Tartuna said, Cherwa, Gimse Yandala Tingu, Gimsen Jebaji, Gimse Yanda Pachila Dine, and Toba in Toba, Tambo Topi Lodi Gigri.
Looking then at this first sentence, moreover, the initial generation of that conceptual consciousness must depend on correct reasoning. What is that conceptual consciousness being referred to? So that is what we had in the paragraph above, in point 4 above, namely a conceptual valid cognizer. Conceptual valid cognizer is a conceptual consciousness. So what we're having now below, the sentence starting moreover, the initial generation of that conceptual consciousness. So this is referring to either an inferential valid cognizer or that inferential valid cognizer's subsequent cognizers. That is what's meant here by conceptual consciousness. To initially generate it, in other words, to initially realize emptiness, depends on correct reasoning. So to give rise to a realization of emptiness, the realization will initially be undertaken or be done by a conceptual consciousness, namely an inferential valid cognizer. To give rise to this isn't easy. It doesn't come about quickly. It depends on an abundance of a correct reasoning. Extensive reasoning is what leads to a conceptual consciousness initially or for the first time realizing emptiness.
Jixaro, humor, and the Jixaro, humor, the humor me Jimsen to Garsos, or the into the humor lavana. Jimsen Garson Coronga said humor Yorba, humor inta, the Shindo delicate, Shindo Chasan humor lavana, the Jimsen Tata Mares, Carson Dinale, Kashing Amo Yora, Kashi humors, Corcosin, Dreda, Denigi, checking Tone. 가시가모차 같이 규모 제가 디네 신도 가르선 그 규모의 미김자 가르선에 딩에 자기 신도 구슈디 신도 된 수고 봐이 제가 권이 계획이 신직발했어 김천전에 아니고 네 자기 규모 자디 신도 처럼 규모를 나나 디 김자야 하다 봐 말했어.
When one is meditating on emptiness, one, as it says here, it will come about in dependence, a realization of emptiness will come about in dependence on correct reasoning. Correct reasoning refers to that the reasons that one is meditating on are correct. So what is a correct reason? A correct reason is a reason that is unmistaken. So what would an illustration of a mistaken reason being? Let's say one eats a piece of fruit, and it's the first time you eat this piece of fruit. You bite into it and say, oh, this is sour. I don't want to eat this type of fruit again because it's sour. And I know because I've experienced it. That's a reason. You haven't just made it up. It's based on a reason. I ate one. It was awful. It was sour. But that doesn't mean that necessarily all fruits of this type are sour. For example, if one eats one's first apple and it happens to be sour, it doesn't mean all apples are sour. So that reason is mistaken. A correct reason is a reason that is unmistaken.
And in Ashen, midi Mogudus, meet my children, Michu Tangudus, Kokiu Samar Sajan, Manzuki, or Kokiu Samar, Carson, Minima, Michu Tangudu, Kongudu, Michu Tangitus, Kongudu, Michu Tangitus, Komichu Tawa, Gumsen Jene, Kongudu, Seton Kokiu Medusevige, and the Gumsen did some time, Komishu Tawa, Gumsen Decha, some tache, Gumsen D, Kokiu Meva Truena, to Mareche, Michu Tadela. Kiu mebache mixta yungure kashe gane pa gane mixta yungure kashe ne chigmi zongro da denhigi jin chigide mixta yungure just mixta yumjen jin ko kiu mindu se ruguna di yumjen ya da ba chago ma yumjen 망해 bare just kashe mixta na kashe kiu me ma kashe pe gawo jon mixta yungure kashe ne ga me na de mixta yungure just mixta yumjen jin ko 기우 매와 죽투고 말이 제산티 고 기우 민도 고 오구도 그래서 고 미슈 땅도와 나가네 디 김천데 야다바 말이스 제산 빼디 나신 다디네 망고요 김천 야다바 많이 봐.
Another easy to understand illustration is you see someone and you notice that their eyes are moist. So immediately you think, oh, this person's unhappy. And the reason for you believing they are unhappy are that their eyes are moist. This too is not a correct reason, because sure, maybe they are unhappy, or maybe they've been laughing a lot and laughing so much they were crying, or maybe they've just been cooking and cutting onions. So there could be several reasons why their eyes are moist, not necessarily that they are unhappy. So therefore such a reason too is not a correct reason. So there are these and many other illustrations that one can think of where we come to a conclusion, but the reason the reasoning that led to that conclusion was not correct.
타르투나 리버니라 투바인라 타르투나 시당아서 동반이 또에게 탑람라 안지게 최고 부여하다 점로체하다 dom부가서 주름송하라 소바다 nen지게 제바체하다 멍부여로바 디나네 쪼디 동반이 또에데 지당아서 동반이 또야려야 안지게 주름송하다 안지게 계절 주야다 지게 라마다 냠려야 소립지야 고보래 이네 쪼디 리버 디나네 쪼 동반이 또에 쪼디 riba yangda, riba jabati, riba juya de res, riba de res. The riba samla matawa na, tongi toba dundalia, chik malam jab, manzo ke chike kesho kazeche na, tongpa yi dotu ma res, chida, dik kukur di na, zo karasan riba de res. Gyumchen yangda samdaya de res.
Then the text continues. Fundamentally, therefore, this process traces back solely to reasoning. Here, as for those who've been coming to many classes, you'll know, I encourage you to utilize reasoning in all your meditations. But whether the meditations are on refuge or ethical restraint, wherever, reasoning is essential. No more so than with the topic of coming to understand reality, coming to realize emptiness. No more so than with this topic. It is a correct reasoning is essential.
난 저기 동반이 또에게 탑람 리바 양다바디 가르송고스네. 당은 저기 做电车남자스电车送过电车다电车될이야 참모다 라바단 참모다 직 멍보여 지자 당보왕 저기 다 동반이 또에게 탑람 제바 제기 삼다에 덴데게 삼다에 약쇼래서 덴데게 삼다에 여러바데 덴데를 멍보 여러바데
The text then says that one must rely on reasoning. And amongst the many different types of reasoning that one relies on in order to realize emptiness, the very best is that of dependent arising. Within the topic of dependent arising, or within the technique of dependent arising, there are approaches which are coarser and subtler. Nevertheless, dependent arising is the supreme or the best of reasonings.
자다 덴데 삼다에 등어서 덴데 라바로 시데 윤지기 덴데다 덴데 주베 덴데 사지 이용고래 진짜 윤지기 덴데 삼다당 아 저기 다 사변지마 따바이나 안델에 뉴구기요 바디 사번 디마다바이나 뉴구기 오메 버쳐서 뉴구기에디 소 인지미 사번실에 땡기요 바디가 저기 땡기요 바디 땡기요 바제 다 사번 찍고 마다 샤바 디다가랑게 뉴구기 되고라서네 대한지 동안 델리아 로봇 튕기 가르고서는 류다 사당 추당 죄고고래 진짜 죄다 사당 추당 죄 근데 사번 데니기 차상 초발에 때네 안 뉴구디게 도 스케네 안 디기요 바디 땅아서 차상기 하고 그걸 차고로 와
Within the presentation then on dependent arising, one that is easier to understand, a coarser presentation, is that of dependency on causes and conditions. This is something we know very well from our everyday life. If we want particular plants to grow, we know we need to plant that specific seed, and moreover, we need to ensure that that seed has the required ripening conditions, such as the right type of soil, right amount of heat, right amount of moisture. And when all those conditions come together, the seed will ripen into the plant that we want. So the result, the plant, has come about in dependence on a cause, the seed, as well as a variety of ripening conditions. So this is a very easy illustration of dependency on causes and conditions.
유단 진지를 되는 되고 그러마도 유단 진지를 마되어봐시 그런 유단 진가 하면봐 뭐보주 기되게 뭐보지 여러 배선 싸우기는 요 말했어. 당 뭐보 간다시네 그 유단 진지를 되고 그래서 우리 되는 주고 그래서
All functioning things or impermanent phenomena, everything that changes momentarily, comes about in dependence on causes and conditions, which means they are all dependent arisings. Everything that changes comes about in dependence on causes and conditions.
어디네게 안단 저기 뭐보 많이 게 최디게 ben에 가서 뭐보 있네. 다가 되네 딱 봐서야 돼. 규단 진기 저와 매번에 규단 제비게 저와 매번에 대식을 되네 딱 봐서야지. 되네 딱 봐서야 돼. 저기 ben에 자수 파초다 수쇼 갈 때에는 당 알아 주가서는 될 돼요도 파초 리들 파리세지 제 파기 리세야디 디 수쇼 리들 돼지는 파기 리스라고 얼마도 수쇼 리들 매나 파기 리라 파초 나야요 말이지 제가다 파기 리디야 수쇼들 돼지 나도 디 수쇼 리들 파기 리지요 봐서 파초들 돼지는 수쇼스라고 얼마도 되는 파쇼도 매나 수쇼라요 말했어. 제가 파쇼도 수쇼 권유 윤제 말해야 돼. 이내 찍찍을 뛰는 주 말했어. 그 파쇼다 수쇼서야지 찍찍을 뛰는 주 말했어. 제가 이거 뛰는 주 말했어. 지금 파쇼라 맞여 봐. 수쇼서요 말해. 수쇼라 맞여 파쇼서요 야요 말해. 제가 되네 파쇼 수쇼 뒤에 수쇼나 파 찍찍을 뛰어 말했어. 맞여 봐. 파쇼 수쇼서요 야요 말했어.
Another form of dependency is that of mutual dependency. So here we can take, for example, near and far. Something can only be called near because it is dependent on there being something far away. So if one is perhaps in a valley between two mountains, and one is closer to the one, this mountain is near, but it only can be called a near mountain because there is a mountain far away. For something to be near, there has to be something far away. And should you then walk to that far side of the valley, the mountain that was near is now far. Again, they can only be called such in dependence on one being near and therefore another being far. So this is a subtler form of dependency, that of mutual dependency. This is just a very brief introduction to dependence arising. This will be looked at much more later. As was mentioned in the outset of the class in the 4 Reliances, one needs to hear teachings and reflect on their meaning. So similarly, think of other illustrations of mutual dependency. So for example, we're all sitting here. I think everyone has a left arm. And the only reason that we can say this is my left arm is because one has a right arm. One requires both. Similarly, tall and short. So outside we have many tall trees. The reason we can call these trees tall is because there are trees which are not tall, which are short trees. But merely saying that this particular tree is a tall tree doesn't imply that it is the tallest of tree, and only the tallest of all trees is the one type of tree that can be called tall. Just any tree that is taller than another can be called the tall tree because there's the short one. And likewise with something that then is called short, say a short tree. That can be still called tall, maybe as a plant, in relation to some grass next to it, because now suddenly that short tree is tall compared to the grass. So here we see a mutual dependency, near and far, tall and short, left and right. Such illustrations are easy to understand, and the reasons simple illustrations are always given first is so that one can get familiar with this way of thinking and included in one's reflections. But there are far subtler presentations which are much more difficult to understand.
다 라신데 간에 쉬어봐도 간저 하고 말에 다들 라신 간에 쉬어봐도 람나 최간에 신앙 코로 라신데 강라에 모두 랑공원이 줍되어지 레베스네 디자오이네요 말해서 최간에 강라에 모두 랑공원이 줍되어지 레베스네 지상 최간에 신앙 코로 라신 강라에 모두 랑공원이 줍이 동바래 했어요. 내게 동바들라 동바이라고 하다. 도나디래. 최강라야 마되바 랑응은이 주비기 동바 동바 되라 다 동바 일에 걸어와 쟁에레스나 디레 동바 있을 때 지산 디도 고래라 그러다
When one hears descriptions of dependence arising or illustrations like I've just given, if one were to think, oh, dependence arising, very easy to understand, I've got it, that would be a mistake. That would be a mistake. Because the subtler understanding that one needs to come to is that in relation to emptiness. So we saw in the third Reliance that teachings of definitive meaning refer to those on emptiness. What then is emptiness referring to? That refers to phenomena such as the self being empty of inherent existence, or empty of self-existence, or empty of existing by way of its own defining characteristics. So in our book on page 29, there are a few synonyms which are mentioned. So you look at those, see what works best for you as an individual. But what it's meaning, what it comes down to, is when it says that a phenomenon, such as the self or any other phenomenon, is empty of true existence or inherent existence or self-existence, it's empty of existing from it in dependence on nothing other than itself. It's empty of its own self-nature. It's empty of being independent of anything other than itself. That is what emptiness refers to. And that can be realized through an understanding of subtle dependence arising.
Bendigo 저기 사번지마 답제 될 누구 기교래서 내가 하고 그때 이제 사번데 나로 누구 기획 누버들 직배 참모디 양아서 하고 말봐야 데니스 누버 데니스 메나 이 말에서 비게 가시 사번 도도지마 답제나 마기와 방고용으로 제산디 누구 기획 누버들 상여 말봐 제산 누버 참모 여바든 가서 하고도 그러면 진행상은 저 락바다 하고 제산 디나신 안 저기 셴을 뛰어봐 락바바 하고도 돼 참모디 될 뛰어봐도 하고 두고 말 제가 니네 상은 저기 된제 참모디 하고 두고 말봐
Even if we take the first illustration that I gave of dependency on causes and conditions, if you plant a seed, a sprout will come. Easy to understand, no one's confused. But even with such an illustration, one can look at subtler levels, because we relate to, whilst we understand that from the cause comes the result, from the seed comes the sprout, or to express it the other way around, from the result came from a cause, the sprout came from the seed, we relate to that seed as if it has some kind of potential for it to grow into a sprout. And that potential is its very nature, its own defining characteristic. And that is what makes the seed a seed. And that is what we relate to as being inherently existent.
that Tony Gor Ma Yanzuki Shedu Gable in there, that minute Tony Tank Dusha, that shade Rua, the Miro, the Mangoyun Gore, it's not Tony or She, and the Cashelia, and the Pan Mapembata, and Digi, and the Chetar Hundoyata, and the Neki Yanga Chimboy Gore, that's not Tony Tank, new to Ruya Maros. That is Shaken Diki and Tony Nisui. 야보 하고 와서 냠명을 토네마 시고 자고로 와 지나디 마 동이게 소수기 냠명이요 같이 다 미니게 취 동이 댄세 될래야 안에 지금 권뇌도 다다던 댄바이나 지구뒤에 민도 하고 와서 고고다 하고네 댄나 홀 댄나 지구뒤에 민도 하고 니수 거의 니수디 지다 고 댄바이나 오고 체다 혼야게 내가 여바다 되네기 매바지 안에 되네기 동이게 댄게 되바 돈이 또 투에 니버유해 되는 집에는 하고 왔지는 돈이고 돈이 띵고로
The presentation of emptiness can be presented in differing ways, and with the presentation there is always a danger that it can be presented in a way that may not necessarily be mistaken but could be understood in a mistaken way, and thereby one can fall into either the extremes of nihilism or the extreme of existence. So one ideally needs a teacher who is able to teach independence on their own experience, an experience gained through their own analysis based on correct reasoning. And therefore, they will be able to give an unmistaken presentation. Because it's also possible that the teacher's experience could be mistaken, and they have tended or are tending towards one of the two extremes themselves, and therefore their presentation also may have error. Moreover, from the student side, should the teacher have experience, then one can check one's own analysis and the conclusions one is coming to with the experienced teacher.
Dempeke Geshe member, Jangan Zuki, Hinyag, Lobsang Dorje, Jangan Zuki, Nesu Hakoya, Dondala, and Jangu, Chikan Chasanga, Nada, Chasang, D. Dondala, Jangu, that, you get Dimatoja, that, Zuki, Chikiton, Toya, Dondala, Tony said, the road the Chago Marwa.
The way I'm approaching this topic, because the entire text is on the subject of emptiness, is we are all here together learning this topic, gaining knowledge, deepening our imprints of the topic. So we are all in this together, so to speak, of deepening our understanding and strengthening our basis for reflection.
Dangbo soso ga kangla soso le jeba che hores di jeba che na tongyu doi ge le la yo de chanda ji ji nga zo le jeba soso le jeba che de ga le so su ge phungbo da nga sa ji su nga ni yo de nga che da nga sa de nga zo phungbo de nga sa da she che che ji da nga sa che yo de ji zang ji nga sa de di ga le jeba che hores di nga sa di ga le jeba che ba na nan tongyu doi le de le la yo de she.
We've heard in the text that one needs to engage in correct reasoning to realize emptiness. Our correct reasoning, though, needs to be in relation to an object, to a basis. So to put it in the technical language, one needs a basis for analysis, something that one is analyzing to come to see that it is empty of inherent existence. So here it's said that the easiest object in which to realize emptiness is the I, or the self. So having this as the basis for analysis is said to be easier to realize.
Do send Dambo, Nadi, Anzulia, Lolia, Shartano, can this share do Sibidi, Yapo Muslim with the kitchen Boreje. The names I don't do something, said in our Susuragi, Nga Sajurvada, do see what I said, do something, I said, Paulolia, can this share do some way dish him to share with her, dish him to share with her.
In this meditation, the very first step is to come to understand, to recognize for oneself how the I, or our sense of I, appears to our mind. This is the very first step, and it's a crucial step to get a feel for how our sense of self appears to our mind.
Ganglaya Maduba, Paulu, Gudan King, Ganglaya Maduba, Paulu, Shabala Maduba, Lola Maduba, Colonel Drubduba, you were Chanzololia, Nangore. Naya Dinis Nangore, in as Dinana and Haku Made, this Nangore. Now I'm asking Takana Yore, something of the Samlola, is Samnana di Ungor, Ding Yobating as a Haku to go Martina, Dinig Ungore, Dina Yore, something. Now I'm asking Takara, something of Samla di Ungore. Gaza say someone Lolia now do Judan Jin Ganga Matuba, Louis Pa Shabala, Lola Matuba, Korongoni, Drup to Pachi, Nango,
This first step is not only a crucial step, but it's a difficult step, because whilst our I appears to us continuously, we are so habituated to it, so used to it, we are completely unaware. To try then and become aware of how the self appears to us is difficult. Therefore, we start with hearing how the I is said to appear to us. But thereafter, we need to look for it and come to recognize this for ourselves. Again, as we saw in the four reliances, not merely accept the words, but we need to do the investigation, the reflection for ourselves. So the way the I is said to appear to us is as if it is independent of our physical mental aggregates, independent of causes and conditions. So our I, or our sense of self, appears to be independent. And thereafter, we need to come to see whether it actually exists in this way or not. But the first step is to try and see how our sense of self appears to us.
Chesa ta ngana zo de cha ki ya khong ro ki ya nga ja ki nyo mo ba ki cha sa de le den li go da nga se rang xin gang la ma rang ne du ba yo re sa bi ge sam lo di jin jin de le den ngana zo ge de cha khong ro nga ja nyo mo ba mang bo le yo ta de ne ge nyo mo ba le yo du an di wang ge an ja le ya ne ba ki ya se so jue ba xian le gang a de ya de ne ge an ji ge nya le ngan ba 되는 아주리아 라신이가 강아 용하디 디용고레스 제가 녀모바 차상 자와 용서디 데니기 나중아 서소설에 강래 뭐 랑용원에 주바 여반 나와 나신 다가 요래 선비 삼로 델레데니와 디 삼로 데다 쪼레 녀모지 디 삼로 메바서 고레소레 제가 디 메바서야 되라 동반이 디 도초디다 그 님보 갑대도 연하면나디 동반이 또 불러드리스 제가 디 도고야디 계신보인바 디레다 동이 도고래 공고래서 계신보래서야디 디레다 제가 디로디 랑원의 두바 짐불로디 메바서와라 동이 마토바나 메바서 두고 말이야 제가 동이 도고래 계신보래서 디레
The self then appears to us as being independent of our aggregates, our physical mental aggregates, independent of causes and conditions. This appearance as being independent is what is meant by true existence. So when an object, in this case the self, appears as being independent, that means it appears as being truly existent. So the meaning of true existence is something that appears to be independent. So there's this appearance to our mind of the object, in this case the self, as being independent, or the synonym, as being truly existent. This appearance isn't merely left as an appearance, but a consciousness grasps at it, believes that this is how the self exists. It exists in the way that it appears. So this grasping consciousness is called this grasping consciousness grasps at, in this case, if the object is the self, as being truly existent. This grasping consciousness is grasping at the self as existing in a way that it does not appear. In a way that it does not exist. So therefore, this consciousness is one of ignorance, because it is not in accordance with reality. So we have an ignorance that is grasping at the self, ignorance of self-grasping. Or it can be expressed as the ignorance of true grasping, grasping at the object as being truly existent. So these two terms are synonymous: ignorance of true grasping, ignorance of self-grasping. Ignorance of self-grasping is only used in relation to the self, but as appearing as truly existent. Ignorance of true grasping relates to any object, the self or any other. Now from this ignorance, this mind that is not in accordance with reality, this consciousness that believes the self to exist in a way that it does not, from this, all our other afflictions arise. Anger, attachment, pride and so forth, they all arise from this ignorance of self-grasping. This is the root cause of all our suffering, because the mere arisal of the other afflictions causes us to suffer. And when we then express those afflictions to others, we cause them to suffer. So it's from the initial ignorance of self-grasping comes the other afflictions. Thereafter, if they influence our physical interactions with others and our verbal communication with others, and we cause others to suffer. So therefore, this ignorance of self-grasping is the root of all our suffering. What is the opposite of ignorance? It is wisdom. And what is the opposite then of this particular ignorance, the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping? It is a particular wisdom, the wisdom realizing emptiness, the wisdom that realizes that the self is empty of true existence. And it's only the cultivation of the wisdom realizing emptiness that can eliminate the contrary ignorance, the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping.
ngati wudu ngati wudu sa da ngati u min sa da o nga le ga le sa da nga ji to gu sa da nga sa bi ti ki na di bi dang gor wa nga khala sa go ye nga cham yam to nga sa di ki na nga di sam dang gor di ine nga sa di ngo ngone ra shin ga ne tu se de di nga ju gi na gu go ma nga ju nga sa le gor di na nga sa di ga wa du ra shin go rang ga ne tu se ba ne nga ju gi na gu go ma de.
When you listen to how you speak, and moreover, listen to how one's thought process, there's a constant stream of self-referencing thoughts and often resulting speech. I'm in a good mood. I'm not in a good mood. I'm going there. I've just come from here. I'm sitting now. I'm listening. I ate earlier. I'm a little tired. I look forward to bed. All of these thoughts that are self-referencing. So this is how we live this life and have lived continuously, life to life. So we're very familiar with the thought of self, but we don't ever think about how does the self appear to us. So there's this constant appearance of the self that we're referencing, but we have no habit yet of thinking well about how the self appears to us.
Dini za da nga ju ge nga se de du sam dan de nga de ga du se ji nga ju nga se de ga su dini nga ju su bu ro wa su bu re ma da nga de re sen dini ngi la kwa re ma da nga ma re dini ngi la kwa re ma je se ngi su bu re nga ma re se nga de ga du se ji du se dan du sam da we ne de so so na nga sam nga de ga yo re nga ga du sam da we ne ma jo so so na sam da na ju sam ko ra chu re nge samade ngadi diwa yoba ru na wala shayu da diwa ninga diwa ye de ga de da kyonzo le garera sin na wala khogina nga se de subu di nga subu ro nga marwa jisang so so nga se de ga du samda we ne ngarang ge samna la ya nga diwa yoba ru na wa shayu do da kyonzo da de da ga ha sum ka shin diwa yor sum de ne na wala shayu ni ro da so so na wa sha da mi ro ka ga yung ro.
So this is our key meditation, coming to recognize how the self appears to us and then to examine whether it exists in the way that it appears. So the self that is so important to us, the center of our universe, where is it? So we may well consider it to be our body. This is often how we refer to ourselves or how the self of others. But it's very easy to understand that, for example, a particular body part such as our arm, whilst we consider this our arm, this is not our self. So where is that self? If I look within myself, I tend to think maybe somewhere here around my heart. Maybe for yourselves, I don't know. Maybe you also have a feeling like that. Maybe you feel somewhere else in your body. Maybe I would imagine within your head, there's a feeling that where I exist, if I look for it, it's somewhere in my head, in my brain, maybe there. So this is where we start. Where is the self?
Longama Yorubesne and Dadira some tabene, Mazu de Yorua, and do studio or Sasa de Yorua. Then you know, the Mota Tang Besne, Mota Tang in the Grua, Johnson Mota Tali, right? John Mota Tali in the Grua, Mota Tang in the Grua. Cesa, then, and then Kuro Mota Tang, Kuro de Dualane, and then that thing I answered de Yorua. Then answer Mota Lapa Chango Marwa. Cesa, Anzu Mota Tang Yorbesan Tang Marwata. They Chisang some other Ni Mota Tavi, Kasang Legalebe, Long among a Chinga champion to some good. Nga setting as a dead day in Adikishua. Chisang a dead day, Jeje, and Amatu, Long Amai, Chitoya, my Morata, and Tikau champion to Marwas. Chisanti, champion to handy that daddy. Now to some another, now to long Ami Kid in Yore, stepping out to some another Yore. Says Ami Kid in Amikeva and Amikeva Legua. Says I'm cure Amikeva and the cure Amidona, American Chugil and Manga did marry a Pudi Legua. Says Puchu and Amarwa. Nati, now to the Nala to that and how to Michibus Kishore, as a day you can Kishore. Says Amikeva Reveson didn't Ami to get Gina Yamana Yorbeson. Yomarwata, as a Chimbuchasa, which is a Yaman and Gungamama Chatur. Nazo some Nala Garson, Nadi Amiki in Yonga, Amiki Yor, Nakasa Yor, Longama Yor, Madeshin Yor, SMP, Samnos Yor. And Dinajida, the new Nadi, Sani Yor, 9 euro, Lojama, the low part of yours, Nazo Samna Yor. Says a Nadi Tapanashi, you are in your dry medican, Chichilikan, Matumba, Coron, Rang, when you troop to getting Lole did go to us. Just do something how would just I didn't money your Sakasa, your 2 year, Sani, your now Lojama, you go to Kishi, Nadi Tahara, and you are getting a corona, Tahara, do you about which now I shall do it. Says I did our in the Ray Marwa. Now some now I shall have it down, doing we in the city, Tata Chaya Marwa.
All of you now, ask yourself, where are you? You say, I'm sitting here. Where were you an hour and a half ago? And I was walking here. I was driving here. Where will you be in a few minutes from now? Sitting in my car. And a few minutes after that, driving my car. And where were you many years ago? I was just born. And where will you be tomorrow and the next day? Well, I assume I'll be here or there. And this is how we think of ourselves. So we are all only in one place right now, but a little while ago and a while longer, we were somewhere else, and likewise forward. So we all will readily recognize that we are all sitting here together now. None of us are in our car, and none of us are in our warm home, although we'll be there maybe in half an hour, and none of us are children. But we link this with a continuity, and we say, I was that child. That child in the photograph, that's me. Driving the car, past, future, that's me. We have this continuum, or this continuity rather, of ourself going back and our projection forward. And this continuity, we relate to it as if it were permanent. And the meaning of permanent is unchanging. So we relate to this continuity of ourself as being unchanging. And this is a characteristic of something being truly existent. Relating to something as being unchanging is a characteristic of it being truly existent. And the self doesn't exist this way. The self hasn't not changed. So therefore, the way the self appears to us has this characteristic of being unchanging, as well as independent. The self does not exist in this way, despite appearing as if it does. this appearance of the self as being independent and unchanging is not at all in accordance with reality. So that then is the first step of the meditation, to come to understand selflessness or emptiness, is how does the object, in this case the self, appear to our mind. And that is, the theory is, as truly existent, or any of the synonyms, whatever works best for you. And that means it appears as if it's unchanging and independent. So tomorrow we'll continue. We'll continue in the text and move forward. But if you have some questions, then do feel free to ask now. Geshe?
In regards to a reason being necessary to develop an inference or this conceptual realization, sometimes we hear stories about, like, they say a student has a lot of merit, and the teacher is given a teaching, and they put the cup down, and the sound of the cup, initiates the realization of emptiness in the student. And these stories sound like the student is not using reasoning. Is it the case that there's some subtle reasoning going on there, or is it talking about, like, a lot of reasoning used previously? Is the reasoning have to be in the moment? A little bit of explanation of how that might work.
As we heard in the text, that the initial generation of the conceptual consciousness, realizing emptiness, must depend on correct reasoning. But one hears, so that's what the text says, and one has, I've heard this a lot, but there also are stories of people who just hear one thing presented for one thing. For example, the teacher puts their cup down and makes a sound, and in dependence on that, they gain a realization of emptiness. So that doesn't sound like any reasoning going on to me, but what is actually happening in the case? Is that person actually employing reasoning, or they're not employing reasoning, but they have done so extensively previously? Can Genna say something on that?
korangi nuba denegi korangi gyumsen samdaje ko nuba nyamane gyumsen samdae komshi yoje ba deni gyumsen chunchunchile dene topa yungure ko dene yanchi sonamgi cho pa도 ba geche bo sawa ine denegi dene ani juk gyumsen kasore 망고시라 삼나다 균능보 삼나보다 남산 삼다 하고 돼 연구로 지자들 나는 저게 강사기 년만에 바지 검시 시중에 더내 연구로디 상예 점내디게 최송비 갑라야 아니 상예 점내디게 되네기 직직 송여디 가시가 남산 동반이 또다 지금 야 파비고 한 톱조에다 가시게 지 다음에 봐도야 가시 믿다 봐도야 가시 지금 되네 연구로 지자 This didn't work. Korangi Nupa Sunamda did it, a Molamda, Sunamda, Digi, and the chicken Yamane Akashi, Tombanilla, Jang Bigit, the Nick Jabba Mongochi Bigit, the Yungurua. Nekoto riba lamsa hago thura riba ngazu bene mi this is the jachim hago thura this mare bene ngazu gi lobju na la ya ji lobju bu mango shwe ne yin gi yin angzi ji 찍라면 남상 하고 그거 같이 살망불라는 마다 한 먹거나 같이 살망불라는 한 먹거나 먹고 요걸 봐. 제상고 많이 남상 그런 거 리버선에 돈에 그 지금 대안에 찍라면 남상하고 돼 연구를 봐대. 이 연구를 그런 직접다 디래. 직접세는 예마디가 직비기 제바지비고 검시여 봐다.
In illustrations such as those, there will be some reasoning going on, but not necessarily much at all. However, in the past, a couple of things would have been done. They would have done a lot of meditation based on correct reasoning, a lot of meditation, as well as have accumulated huge stores of virtue. So independence on those two causes, when they hear as a small reason, an easy to understand reason, as something requiring only simple analysis, they will do that simple or brief analysis and gain a deep realization. Independence on prior reasoning and huge stores of merit. So for example, we'll know from sutra stories, when Buddha Shakyamuni taught, he would say one word. Some students, based on hearing one word, would realize impermanence, others would realize emptiness, others would become Arya beings, others would become foe destroyers. They all heard one word, different results. And this came about independence on prior reasoning, varying amounts of virtue, as well as prayers they would have made. And we can maybe liken it from your own experience to when you're at school. So some pupils immediately get what the teacher's saying. Others really struggle. So there are different causes behind. They're all hearing the same lesson. Some get it straight away, others don't. So here, what it comes down to is prior meditation based on reasoning, as well as vast stores of merit. Okay.
Oh, yeah.
Then thank you very much. Thank you very much.